And you are very, very welcome on this lovely sunny day to the Community Education Network Census launch, community education in a time of COVID-19. And it's great to see so many people attending today. I think one of the nice parts of Zoom is when you open the waiting, when you open the waiting room and you see all the numbers flying up. So we have over 60 people attending here today, which is fantastic. It's the latest in a series of AONTAS online events throughout most of 2020 and what looks like to be the rest of 2021 as well. And as always, it's a real reflection of the adaptable, the reactive nature of community education, but more about that later when we discuss the report. So a little bit of housekeeping. Say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're coming in from today. Please keep your mics on mute when you're not talking. Make full use of all of the reactions and the emojis at the bottom of your screen. I think we're all very used to them by now. And, you know, don't be afraid to comment, and particularly during the breakout rooms later on. And the other thing then, we have the GDPR notice here in the chat box that you can see. So if the event is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, you can switch your camera off. We always encourage you, as you know, at AONTAS to be active on social media. The hashtag today is #CommunityEdCensus. So get tweeting and commenting throughout the event. So we have a very full and interesting agenda as always. We're delighted that the Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Skills, Simon Harris TD, will be joining us by video link. Eve Cobain and Akasato Suzuki from AONTAS will present the key findings from the report. We'll have a panel discussion where we'll be joined by practitioners and policymakers to discuss the report recommendations and impact. And we're delighted to have such an expert panel, which will consist of Kathleen McDonough-Clark, who is the manager of Exchange House Ireland National Traveller Service, Ruth Griffin, Adult Education Officer from Cork ETB, Liam McCarthy, Senior Training and Development Officer from the SHEP Project, and Andrew Brownlee, Chief Executive Officer from Solus. We'll then go over to you, the experts in the field, and we'll hear your thoughts in the breakout rooms and provide plenary feedback before we close the event. So the overarching message of today's event is that educational equality is central to our post-pandemic recovery. And shortly you'll hear from AONTAS CEO Dr. Niamh O'Reilly, who will present the background to and the implications of this really important and timely research. And AONTAS has consistently advocated for the effective funding of community education in order to address persistent educational inequality in Ireland. And as part of this advocacy, AONTAS identified the need to establish a very strong body of evidence via what has now become the Community Education Network Census. And the purpose of this census was to establish really for the first time a real and true picture of community education in Ireland, you know, from who is engaged to where courses take place and how they are funded. But above all, the census examines the impact on learners right across this island. It's also part of our mandate. The mandate from our membership is part of a strategic plan action, which is now being completed. And it's over 20 years since the white paper on community education was published, and I just want to very briefly reflect specifically on chapter 5 of that paper, which was very clear in its articulations on the purpose and value of community education and set out very clear policy actions that were necessary to create and sustain its vibrant future. But as we know, that future that was imagined in 2000 then was severely curtailed, and thanks to cuts imposed on the sector in the intervening years, coupled with a much narrower focus on skills for the labour market, and now the impact of the pandemic. So the white paper at the time did raise our hopes in relation to the future of community education. There was an expectation that we would see formal recognition of its values and worth as it took its rightful place alongside other sectors within the system. And certainly the financial support required to realise this vision hasn't materialised. But we're looking to the future, and we're asking that those commitments in 2000 to providing the community education sector with the recognition and resources that reflect its importance and which can release further potential can finally be realised. So thank you all for attending. I'd now like to welcome AONTAS CEO Dr. Niamh O'Reilly to present the background and implications of the research and policy. Niamh.
Thanks very much, Tara. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to launch this really important piece of work. When we set out to develop this work in 2019, obviously we had no idea what was going to be ahead, but really has given us a real focus and a real value to the research of looking at community education in a time of COVID. Really happy to be able to launch it as well, because it's been a long piece of work, and it's been work that's been carried out under challenging circumstances. So really important that we have the opportunity to share it with colleagues across community education, from ETBs, higher education institutions, fellow NGOs, colleagues across the border, and also from Wales. So really happy that you're here today to share as well as in this piece of research. I hope you see yourselves in this research. I hope you see that it reflects the practice on the ground, because that's really what our intention is. I think we've talked a lot about the exacerbation of disadvantage arising from COVID-19. And based on the findings of this report, and with the evidence base that we have now, AONTAS is calling for a support plan for community education as part of a tertiary-wide education response, ensuring that we have equity of access, engagement and participation right across the tertiary education system. I think with the new department, we have a great opportunity to do that. And specifically our calls, and I suppose just to foreground them right at the start, we're looking for sustainable funding for community education, community education to be seen as part of the tertiary education system and having a really important role in terms of equity of access and educational equality, and also looking for the need for more research on the impact of COVID. Well, we have done this piece of research, we know that there's data available, but we really need to understand the impact that COVID has had on marginalised learners right across the system. So that's absolutely vitally important. So just to take a step back, and why are we focusing on this piece of research? So in AONTAS, we believe education is a public good, and it's a requirement of the state to fund education, particularly for people who didn't benefit from schooling or initial education. And this piece of work not just has resonance at national level, but also international level. There's a new report out on financing adult learning and education that was developed by the Secretary General of the International Council for Adult Education, Katarina Popovic. And it was really interesting to look at the kinds of research that's available at international level. Some of it actually referred to work that we've done through the Finale project, which was supported by colleagues in Maynooth. But there is not a huge amount of research that's done on non-formal or funding for community education. So I suppose it has broader implications there. And one of the things I thought was quite interesting, when we talk about education for public good, this isn't a new concept. Professor Popovic talks about, this really came about after the French Revolution, talking about the value and the need for education and the right that people have for it. And I suppose the question that we ask ourselves now, if community education is the most inclusive part of the tertiary education system, why is it the most precariously funded? And I suppose that really gets to the heart of the central thing that we're trying to look at with regards to the demands, the requests that we have for sustainable funding for community education. So this question we have been talking about a lot, and Tara has referenced the white paper, but through the work and the engagement of members of the community education network that has been led out so ably by my colleague Suzanne Kyle, this has been a question that we need to answer. And in order to support really an evidence-based advocacy work, we wanted to come together and have the evidence at hand to really understand who's engaging in community education, the kind of courses that they're engaging, cohorts of learners, and how it's funded. And if we look at it, and not to be the spoiler alert, but across the 76 organisations that engaged in this report, there were 9 government departments responsible for funding through 51 different funding streams, reaching 15,000 learners. And I mean, even that's a mind-boggling thought with regards to the complexity and the precarity of the funding for community education. And ultimately, that takes away from valuable time of engaging with people on the ground. So I suppose that's just to foreground that. So when we started this research in 2019, which was based on the strategic plan, it was set up and led out by Dr. Eve Cobain, who's going to speak about this research. And I suppose little did she know of the challenge ahead, but she so capably and ably took hold of this piece of research for the first time, this mixed methods piece of research, supported by Leah Dowdall, and also a new member of the team, Akisaro Suzuki, who brought his expertise around quantitative research analysis. But as was that aside, it was really important to have the advisory group, who was drawn from members of the Community Education Network, ETBs, and academics, that really helped us respond to the changing context, ensuring that the research is robust, it's really strong evidence base, and reflects what's going on in the sector. So I suppose what we would say is, like, what if we don't support, what if we don't take on the recommendations that are outlined in this report? Well, I suppose what we do know now is that marginalised learners are the dominant cohort in community education. We may have known this anecdotally, there's different research, to back this up, but also we have it in this report as well. People are empowered to participate. It's very much a holistic approach. It also has a focus on social change. It enables people to engage in basic skills, in access, and also support people into sustainable employment. So they're the vital things that we know are really valuable around community education, which won't come as any news for yourselves in the sector. But really what we've found and the evidence that we have here, particularly from the impact of COVID, is the underfunding for community education. There has been a reduction of funding. We see the complexity and precarity of the funding that I've mentioned, and also the increased demand for community education, the increased demand for learner supports arising from COVID. The need to have a really good mix of accredited and non-accredited provision, which is led by the local need and the needs of learners. And then I suppose vitally going forward as we come out of COVID, and I know there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, there is an importance on having blended learning as an option. It doesn't take away from the need to have one-to-one in-person provision, but also outreach. And that really came across very strongly in this research and also through engagement with our members when we had another webinar just to test out the findings to see if this really is resonating with them. And thankfully it was. The need for outreach to get back out into the communities, to engage with people who haven't engaged over the last year because there's other priorities. And we know there's a lot of data to evidence that, that we have published in different publications. So really, I really want to thank everybody's involvement in this research, everybody who participated in it. And I just want to share a slide here just to give you a sense of the groups really bringing it to life. So this is what it's all about. It's ensuring that people have the opportunity to engage in education, their local community in a holistic way. So we can see the different groups here that have kindly shared photos of the innovation of what's happening at local level, the innovation that happened across the island of Ireland in response to COVID, of keeping that connection with learners, that vital connection, and what some learners call that lifeline during COVID. So we thank those groups for sharing their expertise, for engaging in this research. And I suppose to recap specifically, I suppose, on the policy implications of this, one with regard to funding, the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Fund is hugely beneficial. We would like to see that run again in the longer term, and for it to take into account some research that we did on how to make it an even better fund to be able to support people. Specific funding for wraparound learner supports is absolutely vital. Funding to support non-accredited and accredited provision. And then looking at community education in the round and the potential it has really to contribute to the national access agenda for higher education, access to part-time accredited provision across the national framework of qualifications, and ensure that community education and more broadly educational equality is on structures, any kind of structures and groups within the new Department of Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. And again, then a call for research. We really need to have a good understanding of the implications of COVID and having a specific plan in order to address the impact, the reduction of engagement with a specific focus on community education. So I hope everybody enjoys today, and I'll pass back over to Tara Farrell, our chair.
Thank you very much, Niamh. And I think a real example of the collective approach that AONTAS always takes to its work. And this has been so important in bringing the census to fruition. We'll now hear from the Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, Simon Harris, TD.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be able to address you today, albeit virtually, for the launch of this AONTAS Community Education in a Time of COVID-19 research report. Hopefully it's not going to be too much longer before we'll be able to attend these events in person again. I'd like to begin by sincerely thanking Niamh O'Reilly for the invitation to address this event today and all the team at AONTAS for arranging this event. I'd also like to thank Tara Farrell for chairing today's panel discussion and thank all of you who will be taking part in those discussions. Thank you also to every one of you on the AONTAS research team who've carried out the research, and to Eve and Akasajo for presenting us with the findings today. Finally, my thanks must also be extended to all those 76 community organisations who engage with roughly 15,000 learners right across our country, who participated in this research. You gave up your time, you shared your experiences and your understanding of community education from the ground up. This is so vital and I really appreciate it. This report and the research project upon which it's based is truly novel. For the first time, AONTAS has implemented a broad-scale mixed method research project to understand who engages in community education, what courses are provided, and critically, how community education effectively supports people to fulfil their potential. This makes this the first ever census of community education in Ireland. That alone makes the research and report significant. However, both have of course taken on an even greater importance as they try to capture the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the sector and on some of the most marginalised and hard to reach communities right across our country. Indeed, throughout the pandemic, AONTAS have shared the impact of COVID-19 and offered solutions to my department, including chairing the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Working Group, and they've worked always with a particular focus on marginalised learners. Their report offers a vital evidence base to inform the future direction of community education. The picture of community education that emerges from this report is one of dynamism in responding to learners, inclusiveness in terms of learner cohort, and challenges related to funding. More than anything, it is so clear that community education improves lives. Clearly, there are also some difficulties. Our sense of community has been particularly challenged over the last 16 months. Adult education providers have had to adapt their way of teaching in order to adapt to our ever-changing environment. Over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, vulnerable groups have experienced increased disadvantage. For example, those with lower levels of qualification are most likely to have lost their job as a result of COVID, or have poorer health, and indeed have fewer resources to engage in what is now a seismic shift to remote learning. Whilst the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Fund has made a really positive impact on communities and it has allowed groups to respond to local need, this can't be once off. Much more work is clearly required in this area. In addition, given that the challenges impacting on learning are complex and are negatively impacted by poverty, by poor housing, by domestic violence, isolation, mental health issues, marginalisation and lack of essential supports, more grassroots research such as this project are required. Community education is vital to an inclusive recovery, particularly vital to supporting those who've been hardest hit by the pandemic. We strengthen our communities by including those from all parts of society, and particularly those who have suffered as a result of marginalisation. We must include those with disabilities and with additional needs, those with mental health challenges, and those who are at risk. We have a responsibility to elevate and promote women in order to create a knock-on effect in the wider community. This report stands as a testament to the vibrancy of the community education sector in Ireland. It also constitutes a vital contribution to policy discussions on the future development of the sector as we emerge from the pandemic. So I want to congratulate all of you involved in this fine work and in bringing it all together. In closing, I want to take this opportunity to commend AONTAS on the important service that you provide in the promotion of the value and benefits of adult learning and in your advocacy work on behalf of the adult and community education sector. AONTAS has always ensured visibility for the adult learner and provides them with an opportunity to make their voices heard. Given the last 16 months or so, this service has been even more important. So thank you all. I want you to know that my department is a department for you. We're not just a department for universities. We're not just a department for school leavers. We are a department to make sure that every individual in Ireland can reach their full potential by accessing education in whatever manner or means works best for them. And community education has such a vital role to play in helping that happen, in helping transform the lives of individuals, of their families, of their communities. That's what the work you do is about. That is the difference you make. And I want to sincerely thank you for that. Thank you for the report and the research, and really wish you all the very best of luck with your discussions. Gurmina Maguf.
Thanks to Minister Harris for his very positive comments on community education, and particularly welcome the comments on the solution-focused role that AONTAS have played during the pandemic, including chairing the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Working Group. And also welcome and agree that the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Fund cannot be a one-off event. So now to the main part of today's event, the presentation of the key findings and points from the report. And to do that, we have Eve Cobain, Senior Research Officer, and Akazato Suzuki, Research Officer at AONTAS, who will present the findings to us.
Thanks very much, Tara, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just wait for the presentation to appear on the screen here. So the key areas we'll be focusing on today are really the profile of community education captured through the CEN Census 2020. But we also want to look at the picture that emerges of community education during COVID-19, and particularly the challenges arising from the pandemic and community education's response. Next slide there, Aki. So just to give you some background on the research and the various sources that the census draws from, there were 76 responses to the CEN Census survey, which is really the main data source for this report. However, we also drew from a range of other sources in taking a mixed methods approach in this report. And that includes 48 member consultations, which were conducted really in the immediate phase of the pandemic to capture the impact of that transition to emergency remote learning. We also have 192 learner survey responses, and these responses were captured through collaboration with the National FET Learner Forum and at various intervals across the pandemic so far. And we also conducted 3 focus group discussions. So 2 of these were with practitioners and 1 of these was with learners. And I think these were really important in bringing that human dimension to these findings as well. And finally, we held 5 practitioner interviews, and these were really critical in bringing that kind of depth and nuance to the picture that we were able to capture through the CEN Census survey itself. So in terms of the profile of community education captured, there were 17 counties featured in this survey, and 29 of those were from Dublin, and that really does reflect the nature of the CEN as it currently stands. There were 3,417 learners registered across 164 accredited courses, and 12,226 learners registered across 401 non-accredited courses. And so it's really interesting to see here that there's almost 3 times or more than 3 times as many learners engaging in non-accredited courses during this period. And I think in many ways, what we've been hearing is that that's very much a response to the kind of the ways in which the sector was able to pivot and provide non-accredited options when maybe accredited options were not feasible. And so groups responding to the census were largely small, and you can see here that 48 groups had a staff size of less than or equal to 10, and 51 groups were working with 200 or less learners. And it was also clear that the community education groups surveyed were working with a wide range of vulnerable and disadvantaged learner cohorts. And we identified 11 different vulnerable learner cohorts in the survey. And the largest number stated that they worked with the unemployed, socioeconomically disadvantaged learners, and people with a disability. So just in terms of funding for community education, which was very much one of the initial things we wanted to look at when we kind of devised this survey, there were 51 individual funding streams identified across the 76 participating organisations, and the top 3 were ETB, learner fees, and POBL and SciCap. And there were 9 different government departments recognised here as funders of community education. And 1 in 3 respondents reported more than 2 unique funding sources. So the number of funding streams accessed ranged from 1 to 10. And these findings suggest, I think, that some groups likely experience an administrative burden in terms of reporting to the range of funders. And there were a wide range of courses on offer, as well as a variety of course objectives identified across both accredited and non-accredited courses. And for accredited courses, the top 3 objectives were employability, upskilling and reskilling, and social inclusion. And then for non-accredited courses, the top 3 identified objectives were social inclusion, mental health and well-being, and learning to learn or life skills. And you can see why all of these objectives are so critical in a time of COVID-19. So to turn now to look particularly at the impact of COVID-19 on the sector, it's clear that this was an extremely disruptive period for both learners and practitioners. And 42 groups were unable to deliver some or any of their courses during this period. 2,337 learners were unable to transition to emergency remote learning. 4,101 learners were impacted by the cancellation of courses, and 2,226 learners were waitlisted or unable to take up courses. Groups also reported a loss of funding and revenue just during this period, and as you can see from the table here, 41 respondents reported either a funding cut or the anticipation of a funding cut. 20 respondents both experienced a funding cut and anticipated a further reduction in income. So really a very unstable and concerning time for a lot of community education groups on the ground. So obviously these seismic changes had a major impact on the practitioners working with learners in the sector. And practitioners felt varying degrees of comfort in providing blended face-to-face and online learning in the context of the pandemic. And you can see here from the graph that more practitioners felt prepared to deliver face-to-face learning. And some had the opportunity to avail of training, while others did not. So practitioners also reported that their mental health was impacted during this period, which is really unsurprising, as well as a range of personal challenges in delivering learning. I think these are a few really powerful quotes that came out of the practitioner focus group we conducted. One practitioner stated, "It's an awful lot of change in a short period of time, and it's not even a change you can leave at work. This whole COVID-19 thing is impacting your personal life as well, so it's just something that isn't going away. There's very little relaxing." And then another said, "Our staff aren't all young. The majority of us are in an older age group. We're very good at saying how well we're doing, but you have to say it's really a struggle." So I'll hand over to Aki now, who will speak about learner experiences and community education's response to COVID-19. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of learners' perspective with respect to challenges arising from COVID-19, we could summarize it as difficulty living with the pandemic and learning remotely. One lone parent learner mentioned mental health and emotional fatigue. A learner who was born outside Ireland but currently lived in Ireland stated remote learning is harder than learning in the center. A learner with a disability said, "While I am very happy to have this course delivered via Zoom by an excellent tutor, it is much better to attend in person." A learner from a focus group said, "We only have one laptop and 3 children using it. Internet access is unreliable at times." So from here, we can see, first of all, mental health challenges as one difficulty, and also access to a laptop or digital device and internet connection as another challenge for especially learning online. And in terms of survey data, we compared findings from the relatively initial period of the pandemic, which was June 2020, and the relatively later period of the pandemic, which was from October 2020 to March 2021. In the initial period, 67% of respondents said they enjoyed learning at home. However, this number dropped to 45% in the later period. With respect to a struggle with motivation or a lack of structure when learning online, in the initial period, 27% of respondents said they were struggling, but this number increased to 51% in the later stage. And finally, in the initial period, in the survey, 24% of respondents said their mental health was affected by the pandemic, while in the later period, this number increased to 61%. So in short, as the pandemic went on, the feeling of difficulty among community education learners increased significantly. Now, I would like to focus on community education's response to these challenges during the pandemic. First, they developed new courses in response to COVID-19. In the census, 29 out of the 76 respondents said they developed new courses in response to COVID-19. And these new courses can roughly be categorized into courses to support digital literacy and courses to support well-being. And these 2 points are critical aspects during the pandemic. First, because almost all of the learning moved to online because of the lockdown. And digital literacy was essential for learners to keep learning, so that the community education filled this gap by providing new courses. Also, as we have experienced, the pandemic has been difficult for our physical and mental health aspects, so that community education groups addressed this important aspect as well by providing new courses. In addition to providing new learning opportunities, community education also provided support, additional support, such as additional IT support for counseling, domestic violence services, and financial advice. For example, 36 groups reported they were offering free additional IT support, while there was also a report about increased demand for these kinds of support that were either free or not free. For example, 37 groups reported they observed increased demand for additional IT support. And 23 respondents said that they saw increased demand for counseling support. Finally, we would like to highlight some learner voices that points out why community education has been important for them during this difficult time. One learner with a disability stated, "I look forward to our class every week. This is very important for my mental ability to cope with cocooning. It can be so hard." Another learner from a focus group said, "I would have been lost over the summer without my classes." Another learner from a focus group mentioned, "For about 2 weeks, it was a miserable experience, but now the course is taking up my time. I have a feeling of purpose and accomplishment that online learning gives me." To conclude, the CEN Census was a significant step to systematically analyze Ireland's community education sector, and it has further clarified what we know about the sector and what we still don't know about the sector, which suggests further need for further research. First, more research is needed to have more consultation with groups and learners, thereby helping to develop a long-term strategy to support the sector, not only during the pandemic, but beyond the pandemic as well. In addition, further detail on funding structures and additional funding needs should be investigated to create a coherent and sustainable funding framework. And finally, final demographic data on community education learners should be collected to map local needs in greater depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva Nakasato. That was a very comprehensive presentation in a short space of time, really capturing the depth and breadth of what is being launched today. Really interesting to see the non-accredited participation rate, as Eve pointed out, a reflection of community education responding to the needs of learners during the pandemic. And I think it's also captured the real impact on learners, but on tutors, on providers as well, of the impact on mental and emotional health and well-being. I think the changes from June to October that were captured are really stark. So fantastic presentation. Thank you very, very much to both of you. We're now moving on to the panel. We're delighted to have this. This is our panel of experts today. Delighted to welcome Kathleen McDonough-Clark, Manager of Exchange House Ireland National Traveller Service, Ruth Griffin, the Adult Education Officer from Cork Education and Training Board, Liam McCarthy, the Senior Training and Development Officer from the SHEP Project, and Andrew Brownlee, the Chief Executive Officer of Solace. So you're very welcome this morning to our four panelists. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask. And the first one is around what the findings and recommendations from the CEN Census 2020 mean for your organisation. So I'll ask you in turn to introduce yourself and maybe to reflect on that question around the findings and the recommendations of the census and what it means for your organisation. So Kathleen, I'll start with you if that's okay, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tara. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Perfect. God, I hate being first, but I'll go anyhow. No problem.
No bother to you.
No, this is a powerful piece of research. I've written a few notes, so I'll probably read from my notes. First of all, it highlights for us, I mean, when I was reading through it last night, I was trying to do a bit of study and reflection on it, and I'm thinking, it actually has hit the spot. First of all, it shows that the community education sector is committed, the commitment to engagement with vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. It also highlights that we offer a lot of additional support, that we don't just provide education, we work to create a space where people are supported to engage in education and training. We have a very holistic approach to working with the person, and we're very aware of the reality where people are coming from. But very much important, the census shows the inequality that, okay, COVID has highlighted how much inequality there is, but I can say, and I think a lot of people can say, we're already working from a place of inequality in education. It's not new to us, but this has kind of brought it to the fore that there is a stark inequality in the whole way how education is. I suppose I'll just make a point there that there's so many cuts to education. A lot of children where I work from, let's remember traveller community, a lot of children have gone through the education system, the young adults we're working with, and they came out of a system, and a lot of them still have problems with literacy and numeracy. So again, the census for me is just really important that it has highlighted all of that. I'm just thinking now. It's also shown too that if there's funding for education, it can make such a difference. I mean, as I said here, we had, when this first happened, we were all in shock that, the fact that COVID happened, when our learners, everything we set up in our own organization was set up in the building. We had our computers that we had and stuff. So what happened when the learners completely, I suppose it shows our resilience that when the learners, when they were left on, a lot of them were living on halting sites, had no access to education. A lot of them were we weren't quite sure what to do. So we started off with, the main thing for us was to stay in contact with our learners. We used phones, we used like the post, we made sure where we could visit. We couldn't visit that time, but we did. So it was kind of a bit of a struggle, because it showed that, all of our stuff was centered in the building. But what made such a difference, and I'll just say that, was the migration against disadvantaged funding. We were able to buy laptops. We were able to actually offer supports that was needed. For us, it was like a life changer, because we had young people on the ground that we actually could only help in a very limited way. But the difference it also made for the young person, when they got the laptop, the fact that they felt, they were actually given a laptop, they felt kind of respected. That all I can say is that the whole report, when you look at it, it shows that with a little bit of funding, with a little bit of strategy and thinking, that it's like the old saying, a stitch in time saves nine. We work with people, they call them the hard to reach, sometimes, and they are hard to reach. And sometimes they ask why, because, there's a reason why people are hard to reach. The systems have failed them, not deliberately, don't get me wrong. Sometimes they're geared towards a certain way. There's many reasons, there's many things why a system will fail the person. But in the community education, that's the people we're dealing with. And there's so much potential. There's so much intelligent people out there that are looking for opportunities. And looking at these findings, it's a very, very true census of the reflection of what we do. We work for the people. We try to engage with people where they're at, and we take people seriously. And we, as I said, we don't just offer education. We try to facilitate and enable the person to succeed, and hopefully will go on to progression. And also it has highlighted too, as I said, for me as well, the educational disadvantage that is out there and that does need to be tackled. I hope that answers the question, Tara.
A very, very powerful first input from the panel. So the rest of you have a lot to live up to now after that. I think it was great to hear the passion for the work that you do, Kathleen. And as you say, it's not just about education, it's about enabling people to reach their potential to succeed. Ruth, I'll come to you next. Ruth Griffin from Cork ETB. It's the same question to you in terms of the findings and recommendations from the census and what it means for Cork ETB.
Thanks very much, Tara, and thank you for the invitation to the launch of the Community Education Network's census today. I'm delighted to be part of the panel. I'm only new to further education team in Cork ETB, but I've been a long-time champion of community education, having been involved in youth work and community development for a lot of my career. Cork ETB is fortunate to have a dynamic community education sector served by a wonderful team in Cork ETB, but also a vast array of community education providers across the city and county. And I think the report today will serve to underpin our work going forward. I'd like to congratulate the team in AONTAS for producing such an outstanding report. As the saying goes, what you treasure, you measure. However, as you know, there is a cost to measurement. It takes time and resources. But I think the insight provided through the report, informed by a myriad of community education partners and stakeholders, will lead to informed decision-making, clarity and focus, productivity and meaningful change. The National Further Education and Training Strategy also recognises the need to develop a community education framework by SOLAS, ETBs, community education providers, learners and relevant stakeholders. I think a community education framework will provide an enhanced basis to both record and promote national and local good practice, learner achievement and progression, gathering basic learner data, linking to learning pathways and offering consistent learner support. The report today provides an excellent baseline examining the state and position of the community education sector in Ireland, but also the impact of COVID-19. And in many ways, the research, despite the challenges in doing so, couldn't have come at a better time. As notwithstanding the challenges of COVID, it has also provided a catalyst for change and will further complement current developments such as the National Access Plan and the SUSI Grant Review. What I loved about the report is the vast array of photographs, each in their own way telling the story of the value and impact of community education in Ireland. As the saying goes, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment it grows, not the flower. The way forward to help The way to help people forward is through building relationships and understanding where their journey begins. Increasing evidence and research highlights the importance of education through relationships, that when done well, it recognises the human stories of the learners themselves. It is an approach that embraces learners' complex identities, biographies, and the stories they bring. And community education does this. The kitchen or the canteen, the heart or hub of the community education, provides a wraparound support that learners require. This is what community education does. It builds agency and self-confidence, offering connection in a supportive environment that acknowledges the lived experience the learners faced. So congratulations to AONTAS, and we look forward to using the report as part of our ongoing work in Cork.
Thanks very much, Ruth. It's lovely to hear about the collective approach in Cork, and I'm even looking at your background there. Measures very well with the flower analogy and the environment. So thank you very much for that. Liam McCarthy, I'll come to you next. Again, the same question in terms of the SHEP project. What do the findings of the census really mean for your organisation?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. So I'm a training and development staff in the Social and Health Education Project, and just our project has been involved in community education for 45 years. So having taken the sort of opportunity to contribute to the collection stage of the census, I found reading the findings, like as you've mentioned the word powerful, significant. We'll definitely use it as a resource in our own planning process, strategic planning process, which is going on at the moment. But what I found most significant about it was I suppose the reflecting back of what I found really affirming, to see the commonality with others and the collective valuing and commitment to the work of community education. You know, I guess all of us to some degree can be caught up in our own worldview and to focus on our particular programs. But reading and connecting with the bigger shared picture was nourishing. You know, at some level I knew it, but seeing it sort of as an externalized sort of evidence, sort of that I could sort of engage with, did something significant for me. So I found this both, you know, I'm not around that long with the project, but all that length of time, I mean, but the project over 5 years has been through many parts of the journey of the country and its own life in that time. So I suppose seeing, it's an interesting thing that I know that the focus of the report became a bit the impact of COVID, right? But just to pause a moment with that, right? And just words that I noted and down, like, so things like responsiveness, innovation, reaching disadvantaged groups, diversity, funding needs, the value of the work, the contribution it makes to personal and community development, and the health and strength of our democracy. They all sounded familiar to me when I read them, and perhaps the pandemic and this report in particular way surfaces them, something that we had always been trying to give voice to through the years, and that it has come and I suppose been crystallized in this report, I think is really significant and really powerful. It's powerful because it's true, and it was always the case. And So I think for me, the significance for our project is that, like, I suppose we feel, I mean, I'm saying it I, but I know it's we, right, in terms of the project generally, feel joined into a movement of effort to bring a story which is true to a wider picture, and developing that collective voice is something I suppose I suppose a summary, like, commend and I suppose endorse the findings and recommendations of the report, and found it really, I suppose, encouraging, really, with the word, and affirming. So thank you, Tara. That's the significance for our project, I think. Yeah.
Thanks a million, Liam. And I think I would agree exactly with what you're saying. On some level, we all knew what was happening right across the island, but you know, we're very caught up in the day-to-day, particularly since COVID. And I think to see it all now gathered in print, it's really, really powerful. Andrew Brownlee is here joining us, the Chief Executive Officer from Solus. Andrew, you're very welcome this afternoon. And the same question, from a Solus perspective, what do the recommendations, the findings from the CEN Census, what do they mean to you as the CEO of Solus?
Yeah, thanks, Tara, and afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and joining this event. I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to say it's a really good, really critical, I think, piece of work, because it gives us a real kind of in-depth understanding of what community education is all about, and you know, the role that providers have in communities in giving people access to education. It's also really timely, I think, because it reinforces something that Solus is doing, and also that the ETBs are working on it, and that is actively reinforcing and enhancing the role that community education has in society. You know, I think to give you one perfect example of that, and actually one very kind of up to the minute kind of tangible example of why work like this is important, we are just finalising the Adult Literacy for Life strategy, which is the new kind of 10-year strategy for addressing literacy, numeracy, and the digital divide. And because of the work that's been undertaken as part of that census, we were able to call out the 76 providers, the 15,000 learners that this sector services, and, you know, make it clear that community education providers have to have a role, you know, alongside ETBs, alongside, you know, entry offices, alongside libraries, alongside community development kind of organisations, you know, as part of that response. You know, I think Kathleen mentioned the hard to reach. You know, you are key to being able to get to that hard to reach cohort, and help them get access and help them get the support that they need. So there's an immediate example about how pieces of work like this, you know, have an impact on policy, and we need to kind of continue those efforts to make sure that continues to be the case. I mean, a lot that's called out in the report, I think, is stuff that we can readily agree with, and indeed stuff that we're already trying to make happen. The expanding the Mitigating Educational Disadvantage Fund is an immediate priority, both in terms of the level of funding that will be attached to that, and also moving it into other areas of support for community education. You know, we addressed the kind of access to technology issue as a primary focus last year, but we are very conscious there's so many other areas of support where investment is required, and we're actively looking at that at the moment about rolling that out, you know, earlier in the year, because we were also very conscious that, you know, we were trying to kind of roll the fund out in a very short period of time, which didn't give either ETBs or the community education providers the kind of time and space to come up with maybe the more strategic kind of interventions that were required. But it's really important, and it will continue. I think consistency of approach and support of community education, that has always been a key goal of ours, making sure that if you're a community education provider in Donegal, you have the same access to potential fund and potential support that you do if you were in the city of Dublin, or if you were down in Cork. I think the fund actually has kind of helped that, because it's brought ETBs together to kind of agree common approaches and common criteria for funding. I was actually really heartened to see the research, even though you do highlight something we've known for some time around the sheer volume of different funding sources that community education provision attracts, and the complexity and the bureaucracy that creates for providers. I actually think the research is finding a kind of evolving picture there, because from what I remember, it was really kind of fragmented and really balanced. But it seems now that the majority of providers do access funding from the ETB alongside other sources. So I think that's a positive for me, and something I'd like to unpack a bit more. I mean, in terms of the other areas that you call out, you know, the kind of learner support for community education providers, you know, making sure that there's funding for unaccredited provision as well as accredited, and then providing that support so that those accredited options can be offered more and more. I mean, I think, again, we would agree with that. I think it's just about finding the right solution to make that happen, because there is a reason why ETBs exist, and why they were created as kind of oversight bodies for further education and training to drive responses to meet the needs of their regions. And it's the ability, well, part of the reason is the ability to do things at a scale that smaller providers couldn't. And so there is already work to establish a kind of more consistent learner support framework that includes things like, you know, financial support and access to childcare and all of those critical things that I know that your providers require. You know, there is a real push to develop the quality assurance and quality enhancement processes across ETBs as well. So how does that correspond with supporting the work of community education provision around, you know, around accredited, offering accredited options, and also making sure that there's space for that funding of unaccredited provision, but it also links to kind of longer term, wider pathways. So I think there is a real need to do something in that space. What the solution is, I just think needs a bit of working out, but the urgency is not in doubt. I mean, the report identified all of those kind of information sources that identify we have a problem now. We have lost an awful lot of learners who disengaged with education during the COVID pandemic because they just weren't suited to purely kind of online delivery models. You know, QQI accreditation levels for 1 to 4 through the floor. Our own PLSS system recorded major declines in participation by some of the most at-risk kind of target groups. The SLMRU analysis showing adult education levels down about 20% overall year on year. And even in the last couple of days, we've been looking at the kind of targets we work with ETBs on, and things like, you know, creating employment, facilitating progression, increasing the level of lifelong learning, all going through the roof up to 2019 and falling through the floor in 2020. So we have a real and urgent challenge. And I think the key is just working together to try and find a way to kind of get this right, increase investment and respond effectively, and to reset effectively and re-engage with that large base of learners and get them back on a pathway of learning.
Andrew, thanks very much. And it's great to hear that acknowledgement of the urgency in relation to community education and the number of learners that unfortunately disengaged throughout the pandemic because of a number of different reasons, and also that expanding the Med Fund is an immediate priority, and that consistency of approach, which I think particularly, and I know from our perspective in Longford Women's Link, the rural-based providers will be very happy to hear. The second question I have for the panel is around what is needed to maximise the potential of community education. And Kathleen, I'll come back to you on this one. You know, you were talking about the inequalities that have always been there. You know, COVID has shone a spotlight on them, but they're not new inequalities. They've been there all along. What do you think is needed now, having heard Andrew's input? What do you think is needed to maximise the potential that community education has?
Can you hear me, Tara? Make sure.
Yep, absolutely.
First of all, thank you for all the speakers as well, and thank you. As I said, without the ETBs, we wouldn't be doing what we do. You know, they're our support and our lifeline. We need a strategy. Let's put it this way. I was just doing a bit of reflection. We're a very large part of the community, and we work with a lot of people on the ground. There are different pillars that's in the education. You know, higher education, you know, the primary, the school. This is a whole community. We're talking about people here. We're talking about, you know, people who want to progress, people who want to work, people who want education. They're there, they exist. we have access to them. We know them. We're working with people. It's not new to us. It's like we're the invisible, sometimes it's like an invisible cloud around us. We're here. There should be a strategy. It should be included. It should be linked into the rest of the system, because a lot of people are there, as I said, systems might have failed them or they dropped out. There's many reasons, but change can happen. And people are not stuck at any particular point in their life. You know, if a person comes to us looking for education, it is so powerful and so important that at that moment we can offer them the best we can, and we can link them in to the rest. So I would say look at a long-term strategy for this sector. It needs to be supported. It needs, I mean, if I had independent funding, I'm just talking top of my head, it could be any person here speaking from a community, from an community education. I know the needs of the people. There's training I'd love to put on, but I don't have the facility to do it. There's needs that are met that we know. We have a wisdom and an experience that needs to be shared, or it needs to be facilitated, because it's not like we're doing it in isolation. It'll be a win-win for everybody. You know, the way a stitch in time saves 9. You invest here, you don't have to invest it down the road. You know, people don't fall into different areas because you're meeting the needs. It's important to keep focused. Strategy, connectability, funding, and to be aware of what we do, and accountability too. That's important. You know, I mean, this is like, I suppose for us to maximize this, we need to be taken seriously. We need to be recognized for the work we do, and we need to be funded. We are funded in so many ways, but it can be difficult to, you know, there's a whole look at, but also that we should be able to, the important thing here is the person, is the people that we work with, and how do we make their educational journey, their training journey easier. And so you do get so tired of hearing the disappointments of the inequality. You see it every day. You know, you can see the potential. And if you don't catch that person when it's needed, you might lose them. It's like losing a child from school. If you don't get them in the first few years, then, you know, where does that lead to? So I suppose what I'm trying to say, I don't believe things ever are ended. There's always the possibility. There's always potential. I'm supposed solution focused rather than not. And I think, yeah, I suppose I wrote something down here and I'll just read it as it is. So I'll stop, because if I start talking, I'll keep talking forever. We need a long-term strategy to support our sector. We work on the ground with the communities, and we can see how much of a difference it can make for a person when they are supported and respected. The hard to reach are there because somewhere along the line they were let down. Whatever, there's no blame, it's just somewhere along the line something happened. Systems fail them. When they come to us, we have the opportunity to support them on their success in so many ways, resulting in a win-win for everybody. Things can change, and we can and are making a difference in the lives of people who are deemed hard to reach. I suppose I hope that answers your question, Tara.
100%, Kathleen, and thank you very much for a really passionate and sincere response to the question. And I think, you know, that comment about change can happen is really powerful, and building that into a long-term strategy. Ruth Griffin, I'll put the same question to you as well. You know, what do you think is needed to maximize the potential of community education?
I suppose to reiterate some of what Andrew said, I think the Mitigating Against Educational Disadvantage Fund was an excellent example of investment and funding in community organisations. We were fortunate in Cork to receive almost €960,000, which went straight into communities. And I suppose, as the census report identifies, a lot of the respondents were from Dublin, but that doesn't take away from community education in rural areas. And I know in Cork, because we've we think we're the capital, but we do have a significant rural community, including the islands as well. And what the Mitigating Against Education Disadvantage Fund allowed those local kind of smaller rural community groups to get investment in their areas in a way that they wouldn't normally be able to leverage additional funding if they were in an urban area. And I think that's identified in the report, where there's over 51 different funding streams going into different community education providers. I think also what we saw from the Mitigating Education Disadvantage Fund is the vast majority of the funding went into IT devices and technology, and that allowed us to connect with the direct provision centres up in Mill Street in North Cork, learners who wouldn't normally be able to access some of the facilities that are available in Cork City, or to link with their own communities as well. So it was great to see that. But you can't just have a one-off investment in technology. It needs to be on an ongoing basis to upskill staff, to keep the technologies updated. But I know when we were doing the scheme, it was that there was 3 strands to it. So it also included learner supports and COVID responses. It would be interesting to see in other iterations or future iterations of the scheme what the learner supports would look like and what community education providers required. Things that we saw coming in were what seemed like simple things like dongles, phone credits, clothing jackets for outdoor horticulture projects. And I suppose the challenges for ETBs going forward is how do we administrate that? I think any of you who were at the coalface were probably had throwing our hands in the air at the administrative demands required from ETBs in terms of quotations and everything else. But I suppose how we can do that in a transparent process that meets all kind of government and compliance issues, but also doesn't overly burden organisations while meeting the needs of learners at the same time, which I think is important as well. And I suppose the final point then is, I suppose alongside the report is the National Access Plan, and to kind of comment on kind of what Kathleen was saying, I think that whole of education point is critical. It's about kind of building on family learning processes, but it's also, you know, that everything isn't siloed from school completion, further education, HE, that we all have kind of pathways along the spectrum, and that communication is about communities and it is about families and networks and support. So I think it's imperative that we all work together, and I suppose more so community education providers do see that, from the homework clubs, the breakfast clubs, to the community education, to language support, and you're kind of right in the centre to see all that happening. But so too are ETBs and library services. So it's building the capacity across the agencies to work together in that.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and very collaborative point to end on. Liam, I'll ask you the same question. In your opinion and from your perspective in the SHEP project, what do you think is needed to maximise the potential of community education?
Thanks, Tara. I think 2 significant things, really. I noticed the 50% respondents in the report had either mentioned they had had a funding cut or they were anticipating one. And I think just to note the significance of that, particularly at this point in time of year, like if managing committees and let's say practitioner staff, I mean, are anticipating coming autumn or coming next year particularly, that sort of funding scenario is going to impact on the choices they make in relation to provision they put on or try to organise for particularly groups that are hard to reach. And I think it wouldn't go far, it may, to make a statement from the centre in relation to funding stability for the community education programme for the autumn and the coming year particularly. I think the bigger picture around the strategy, I suppose there's immediate urgent need, I think, in terms of stability, to take that bit of uncertainty along with all the other uncertainties out of it. Could a statement be made around that? And I think the broader, I suppose, piece is that, our strategic piece is that I think it's important to continue to advocate for and open up the widest understanding of education possible. That is for skills, life, social connectedness, equality, personal and community well-being, and for the health of our democracy. And I do think that's embraced, but I do think we need to deepen our understanding for it. You look around the world, you see democracies are threatened. I mean, you look into political philosophy and you see the importance of education to supporting the strength of democracy. So if it is only, or if it was too narrow, let's say, a focus on skills development, we lose out on, or lose sight of, the impact it has in terms of all these other aspects that education brings. And like connected with that is, let's say, I suppose, a deepening, because I don't think it's not just not there, but it is complex. The understanding that actually community education provision is delivered and potentiated through the fabric of our community voluntary sector. All of those people involved in community organisations, service provision, community development, community education, if that may be the main focus, and others. And I think Andrew mentioned that sort of like that picture alongside libraries, right? It's sort of like a cloud of activity. And I think this process, this report serves it, but I think it's important to keep attention to deepening that understanding to maximise the potential and potentiate it for the future. So there's a immediate picture and continuing to work towards a bigger, more holistic embrace of what education is. That's what I think.
Thank you very much, Liam. Very succinct as always. the final point, or the final word, Andrew, I'm going to leave to you. And as I'm sure it's no surprise to you, there's been a lot of talk around funding, and you already addressed that in your first input around the priority around expanding the Med Fund. And just a couple of questions, if you don't mind. One is, and this picks up on Ruth's point about future iterations of the fund and going beyond investment in technology. And then the second point, and I see Susan Cullinan has raised it in the chat as well, around the timing. I know one of the issues, even though it was very welcome last year, was the timing in getting the Med Fund completed and money spent and all of that. So not trying to put you on the spot or anything, but we'd be delighted to hear your input on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tara. And I mean, I suppose in terms of what we need to do next, and it ties in with both of those questions, I think Kathleen hit the nail on the head. I think, it has been recognised that there's probably a need for a more kind of cohesive strategy around community education and its role within the wider education landscape. There was initially a body of work scheduled for 2020 to develop a community education framework. It was one of the key priorities called out in the new FET strategy, and it was considered to be one of the first things that we should focus on. Because of the COVID crisis and because of a bit of political instability, which delayed the launch of the strategy until the second half of this year, that work was paused. And I think it was paused for good reason, because we had to find a way of kind of dealing with the emergency response that COVID brought, and introducing the Mitigating Educational Disadvantage Fund was part of that response. But I think now the time is right to kind of look at that community education framework again and start looking at how we all work in partnership to put it all in place. And in a way, I think the fact that you've done this piece of research first, and I'm also aware that ETBs and ETBI are also doing a similar kind of study on kind of the role of community education framework, role of community education. I think that gives us a perfect platform to really bring us all together and kind of look at what that framework needs to mean, because I think it's really important that that's in place as soon as possible. And if you look at what's called out in the further education and training strategy, I mean, I think that the types of principles that framework needs to reflect, plays to a lot of the points that are raised in your report and have been raised at many events like this, about facilitating the diversity of learning, ensuring consistency of support for learners and for community education, regardless of where you are in the country, embedding technology to maximise community access, delivering quality learning experiences, linking to pathways within FET and beyond, tailoring the approach to data and outcomes to reflect the delivery model of community education, and working in partnership with ETBs to ensure a kind of overall kind of strategic approach to it. I mean, I think all of those principles make sense. So I couldn't agree more with Kathleen that, now the time is right to kind of turn that into a strategy, turn that into a framework, and use the knowledge that we've built up over the last kind of 18 months, and also the urgency of finding ways to deal with those very important issues that we talked about today. I suppose just on your specific questions on the Med Fund, there's work ongoing between ourselves and ETBs to try and put the framework in place so that can be rolled out much earlier this year. I'd love to promise pre-summer. We're still discussing that, but if it's not pre-summer, it will certainly be very, very early in the autumn, so that you have a much longer kind of lead-in time to kind of work on proposals that and access funding. So that's that's hopefully a positive answer to the Med Fund question anyway.
Andrew, thank you very much. I think that's the perfect note to end on. I'd really, again, like to thank our panel of experts for giving of their time this morning and speaking really passionately about their organisations and their role in their own organisations, as well as the findings and the recommendations from the census report. So we are now going into breakout rooms for just the next 20 minutes. There are 2 questions. Katie has them in the chat, I think, earlier on. We might just put them back in the chat again. There's 2 questions that we want you to think about, to reflect, to discuss. One is what you feel are the most striking findings from the CEN Census 2020 and why. And secondly, what would you like to see in a future CEN Census? There will be a note taker facilitator in your breakout room. We'll come back then and we'll have 5 minutes to feedback, and then we'll close the event. So plenty of discussion and keep the themes from the chat going. everyone for your participation in this. We're going to do a very, very, and I mean very quick round of feedback. So Niamh, I'll ask you to feedback from group one, please.
Thanks very much, Tara, and thanks to the group. What struck people a huge amount was in terms of 51 funding streams for 76 providers across 9 departments, the messy, highly bureaucratic process around funding. In terms of moving forward, I think there is a need to dig down more into understanding funding. If you fund community and voluntary sector more broadly, the impact that that has on community education. There's a need to focus in the next census on rural groups, engage and expand the groups, have a really clear mapping of the groups that are engaging. I know that's something that we were looking at as well. And looking at how we can feed into the community education framework going forward, so that Andrew mentioned how the groups can be supported into that, and also to look at participation, election participation at local level in the next census. But I would say we'll engage again with our members to look at shaping the next census, so it's not just a once-off. And I'll just leave it there as well. Just hand back to yourself, Tara, under pressure.
Thanks, Niamh. Our next group was Suzanne is feeding back, I think.
Hi, thanks, Tara. Yeah, really briefly, and we were cut off mid-conversation as well, but we're having a really interesting conversation. And just the point was made, first of all, that it was just, exceptional and incredible that community education survived it all, given all the challenges, and that was just remarked upon, and the fact that it was such a great achievement, and AONTAS was congratulated on their research, and just that the evidence is really important in reinforcing and contributing to the discussion. It was just striking. Some people in the group noted the range of learners that have disengaged, and looking at how and the challenges of supporting people to re-engage, given all the different challenges that people are facing and people's fears about returning to education, and maybe the possibility of looking at some kind of other senses in terms of where are people now, and what challenges are they facing in terms of re-engaging. The idea of, I suppose, the challenges of assessment in accredited provision at the lower levels in particular, and it was just noted that NAL are participating in a pilot with QQI and looking at assessment in online learning, and just the need for supports around training of tutors, building resources for developing and delivering online learning, especially at lower levels. Just the innovation of the sector in terms of, I suppose, it was noted that there was a huge amount of non-accredited provision, and it was community education coming into its own there, and showing that non-formal or informal methodologies of engaging people are so important in that context, and that the cups of tea and the just talking to people, and that keeping people together, and that non-accredited provision rose for those were some of the reasons, and that just we'd have to look at things in a new way. And just one of the big points that came up was just the fact that this is happening within the context of huge social and economic and political issues that the people are facing, and the issues around poverty, that the issue of education exclusion is happening within that broader context, and that needs to be looked at, and that people's lives are often very chaotic, and that we need to continue to work with, for example, homeless services, and also look at rolling out broadband, things like that. So all those, I suppose, wider access issues that people are facing need to be looked at, and that this is one part of it, but that we're part of a much bigger picture, and that we have to work with all the other agencies and services that are dealing with all those bigger issues. Thanks, Tara.
Brilliant, thanks, Suzanne. Katie?
Great, thanks, Tara. Eve is going to give
Eve, sorry, yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. So yeah, just to fly through it, we actually only got to the first question, but it was felt that the report really showed that confirmation of commitment and diversity of the sector, and the value that community education really gives to learners. In terms of the approach, it was felt that the quantitative research was really an important thing to be bringing to the table at this point in time, and this had to be also underpinned by qualitative research. And I think it was kind of echoing what Liam said earlier. It was really felt that the research gave a sense that practitioners were not alone in this, and maybe where they felt alone at an earlier stage, seeing themselves reflected in the report was a real help around the challenges. And then finally, mental health and well-being, just keeping an eye on that and constantly monitoring the impact of that. It was really interesting for people to hear about how learners have fared over time. So I think that's an important piece to take forward.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Eve. From group 4 then we had Laura and Marta. I think Laura's feeding back.
Marta was actually taking notes first.
Sorry, Marta.
No worries.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we had a really nice and interesting conversation in such short time. So the main point was that it is great to have such a strong and solid document that reflects and like all issues that we were having during the pandemic, so that the document like reflects reflects very well what happened. And then also, we talked about how people were struggling with motivation and mental health during the pandemic, and how this was very similar through all different sectors. And for the future, we actually also said that so far it looks that we have inefficient resources, and that we can start from now and probably from these documents that from this document, and also for the future that we really need to keep an eye on mental health and well-being, because after this period where all people were struggling, it will be hard to keep the momentum and keep going ahead in the future.
Thanks, Marta. A lot of common themes coming through here. Aki is going to feed back from group 5.
Yeah, I'm going to focus on one particular point. So the striking point from the census was that the number of unaccredited courses, especially because there was a general trend move from accredited courses to not from non-accredited courses to accredited courses over years. But then also we discussed actually how important non-accredited courses can be. So that was kind of main point from our group.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aki. Kellyanne from group 6.
Thanks a million, Tara. I know we're time is of the essence, so I'll be super quick. I'll focus on one point from each question. So the first question about what the findings, the overall feeling was that while the research is amazing and it's a really invaluable source to have, that the focus now on this is the need for this research to now inform policy and kind of focus on strategic implementation of all the great work that we're doing to make sure to like benefit access and make sure the research is being used well. And then I guess when we were talking about what people would like to see on the next census, there was a kind of consensus that we'd love to see more information on the kind of learner and practitioner input, and particularly around kind of access issues. I know some things that were raised kind of were kind of the application process sometimes being arduous and a barrier for learners, and also data collection methods as a barrier for learners. So they'd love to see more input from learners and practitioners on that if another iteration of the census is put forward. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kellyanne. And Emma from group 7.
Thanks, Tara. So the group agreed that the census reinforced what they already knew from their experience on the ground, and then expressed that it's great to have that documented. And then what would you like to see in a future census? A recording of individual supports like peer mentoring that go above and beyond the usual remit of what's expected in an education setting, and also record what worked to combat the short-term challenges and what supported learners getting past the longer-term challenges, especially as we look forward at longer-term blended learning plans. And the GRIP then encouraged us as well to look at good practices recorded in the census research and consider how those could be rolled out further. That's all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. And finally, last but not least, from group 8, we have John, who's going to feed back.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Yeah, so the other speakers covered a lot of what was raised within our group, but I suppose the standout was whilst the Met funding was really welcomed, it was just felt that it was, it was given before Christmas. There was a lot of time and effort went into trying to spend that and manage the funding and so forth. So that was one of the main, the standout points from it. And just for future census was, the census is during the time of COVID. It'd be nice to do a census that kind of was, non-COVID related. And they were the standout.
Great. Thank you, John. It would indeed be nice to do something that wasn't COVID related. So thank you very much for your feedback. Gurbila Mahagav Galer, Tosulagam Goan Shift Hatnavas and Law. Thank you all so much for turning out in such great numbers today. I think it really shows the vibrancy, the dedication within the community education sector, as Minister Harris referred to, the dynamism that's within. And I hope you're leaving now with some renewed hope that the impact and the value of community education is now being recognised, being captured, and today being evidenced. So, you know, following on from I suppose the whole theme of today's event, if we're really serious about meeting the learner and community needs, then we have to see the AONTAS recommendations that Niamh outlined being adopted. And that's commitment to equitable, sustainable, multi-annual funding, ensuring that community education is recognised as a key part of creating an equitable system, and supporting national research to build an evidence base. And these recommendations, they not only respond to community needs and to the recovery path post-COVID, but they recognise the significant contribution that community education makes to Irish society and provide real opportunities, as Kathleen pointed out, for learners to reach their potential and succeed, and also to enable the providers to facilitate this. And, you know, as was pointed out by Manny today, community education is vital to an inclusive recovery. So I really want to thank everyone for their input today, to Niamh and the AONTAS team for another seamlessly run event, and also for a really brilliant and vital piece of research. To our panel, to Kathleen McDonough-Clark, to Ruth Griffin, Liam McCarthy and Andrew Brown-Lee, and to all of you for your valuable input. I particularly want to thank the members of the CEN Census Advisory Group who played such an important role in this. Leah Clarkson from Warren Mount Community Education Centre, Camilla Fitzsimons from Maynooth University, Maria Flanagan from Oncason, Mary Flannery from Limerick and Clare ETB, Pamela Latimer from here at Longford Women's Link, Elaine Vince O'Hara from Dublin and Dunleary ETB, and Jane O'Kelly from Dublin City University. One more date for your diary is the launch of the FET Learner Forum report on the 21st of July. You will see information about that in your emails and on social media, so do keep an eye on that. And thank you again very much for your input, for your contributions today, and happy reading of the report. Slán.